Spring 1943, the skies over Western Europe had become a deadly corridor. Allied bomber streams were pushing deeper into German territory, escorted by swarms of fighters, while the Luftwaffe scrambled to protect its cities and factories. High above the Ruhr, the steady drone of four-engine bombers filled the air, their contrails carving white scars across the blue. Suddenly, a different sound broke through, a heavier, deeper growl, signaling the arrival of something unusual. Twin engines pulled a sleek airframe into the path of the bombers. It wasn't a Bf-110, long dismissed as too slow and vulnerable, nor a Ju-88 pressed into a role it could barely survive. This was something new, faster, heavily armed, and terrifyingly direct. Crews called it the Hornisse, the Hornet. As the formation closed in, its armament became clear. Cannon barrels protruded from the nose like a set of steel lances. 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters, even a 50 millimeters gun in some versions. Firepower designed not for duels with nimble fighters, but to tear open the armored bellies of Allied bombers. For the men inside, the flying fortresses and liberators, the sight was chilling. Few aircraft in the Luftwaffe carried such concentrated firepower, and even fewer could unleash it with the precision of this new machine. In its first attacks, entire bomber elements were scattered as the Me-410 ripped through their defensive fire. American crews later admitted a grim calculation. It was often safer to wait until these predators had exhausted their ammunition or descended to land before daring to close in. Until then, every approach risked ending in flames. The Messerschmitt Me 410 had entered the battlefield, a weapon born from desperation, armed to the teeth, and determined to claw back the skies for Germany. By 1941, the Luftwaffe found itself in a tightening noose. What had been a force of swift victories during the Blitzkrieg campaigns was now straining under the weight of attrition. The Bf-109, though still effective as a single-engine fighter, lacked the range and firepower to blunt Allied bomber streams. Its stablemate, the Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighter, had proven too slow and too vulnerable in the Battle of Britain. In response, Messerschmitt rushed forward with a new design, the Me-210, meant to reclaim the heavy fighter role. But the 210 became one of the most notorious failures in the Luftwaffe arsenal. Reports from test pilots and frontline squadrons described vicious stall characteristics, uncontrollable spins, and vibrations so severe that even experienced crews hesitated to fly it. By late 1942, the Me-210 was withdrawn from service in embarrassment. Yet Germany's need for a heavy fighter had not diminished. It had grown more urgent. The United States had entered the war, and daylight raids were now crossing into the Reich itself. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and Consolidated B-24 Liberators, escorted at first by short-range Spitfires, threatened to overwhelm German industry. The Luftwaffe needed something that could punch holes in bomber formations before they reached their targets. A specialized Zerstorer, a destroyer aircraft, was demanded. The Reich Air Ministry turned again to Messerschmitt, insisting that the failed 210 be reworked into a viable weapon. The directive was not only technical, but political. German industry was already stretched thin, forced to prioritize resources between tanks, U-boats, and experimental jet projects. Producing an entirely new aircraft was impossible. What could be saved from the Me-210 program had to be salvaged. Daimler-Benz offered the powerful DB603 engine, a heavier and more reliable successor to the DB605. With it came the promise of speed and lifting capacity, two traits the Me-210 had sorely lacked. Unlike the Allies, Germany could not rely on external support or programs like Lend-Lease. The Hornisse was entirely a domestic effort, forged under resource shortages and Allied bombing campaigns. Aluminum supplies were dwindling, factories were under constant attack, and skilled labor was thinning as men were drafted into the Wehrmacht. Every Hornisse produced was a symbol of Germany's determination to remain self-sufficient in the face of overwhelming odds. But the gamble was steep. The Allies, particularly the United States, were producing aircraft at rates Germany could never hope to match. In 1943 alone, American factories rolled out over 25,000 heavy bombers, each demanding an answer from the Luftwaffe. By contrast, the Me-410 would never see production figures beyond a few thousand. It was not intended to match numbers. It was intended to deliver shock. Thus, the context of the Me-410's birth was one of desperation and ambition. It was meant to be the spearhead against the American bomber offensive, a weapon that would force the Allies to reconsider daylight raids. It carried the political weight of salvaging Messerschmitt's tarnished reputation, the industrial challenge of building a reliable heavy fighter under siege conditions, and the strategic hope of stemming the tide of destruction raining down on German cities. For the Luftwaffe, the problem was clear. Without a heavy fighter that could devastate bomber formations, Germany's war machine would be exposed. The Hornisse was the answer, a second chance for Messerschmitt, and perhaps a last chance for the Reich to hold the skies above its heartland. The Me-410 emerged as the direct successor to the ill-fated Me-210, carrying the burden of repairing Messerschmitt's reputation and filling a critical gap in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. Engineers lengthened the fuselage, reshaped the wings, and reinforced the airframe to address the notorious instability that had plagued the earlier model. Most significantly, they fitted the new design with Daimler-Benz DB603 engines, 12-cylinder, inverted V-power plants delivering 1,750 horsepower each. These engines transformed the aircraft, pushing it to speeds of over 390 miles per hour and giving it the reach needed to intercept bomber streams far inside German airspace. The Hornisse design balanced offensive punch with defensive innovation. The nose was configured as a weapons bay, with a standard battery of two 20mm MG 151 cannons and two 13mm MG 131 heavy machine guns. But what made the aircraft infamous was its modular armament system. Crews could install additional weapons: twin 30mm Malawian Quachas 103 or 108 Malawian Quachas cannons, or even the formidable 50mm BK-5, a weapon derived from a tank gun, capable of destroying a bomber with a single hit. This level of firepower gave the Hornisse its terrifying reputation among Allied crews. Defensive coverage was provided by remote-controlled barbettes on either side of the fuselage, each armed with twin 13mm machine guns. Operated by the radio operator, these barbettes allowed rearward defense without the drag penalty of man turrets. On paper, the system promised an elegant solution. In practice, results varied. Gunners struggled with limited fields of fire, and the barbettes were often less effective against determined enemy fighters. Trade-offs defined the Me-410's character. It was devastating against bombers, able to shatter tight formations with long-range cannon fire. Yet it remained a heavy, less agile aircraft, vulnerable to escort fighters like the Spitfire, P-47 Thunderbolt, and eventually the P-51 Mustang. Compared to its contemporaries, the British Mosquito was faster and more versatile, while the American P-38 could fight both bombers and fighters with greater agility. The Me-410, however, was singular in purpose, a bomber-destroyer built to inflict maximum damage in the shortest possible time. Production began in 1943, with roughly 1,160 Hornisses completed before the war's end. Each carried an industrial cost Germany could scarcely afford, but the design represented both a technical salvage operation and a bold attempt to claw back air superiority. Contracts were pushed through under pressure from the Reich Air Ministry, and Messerschmitt's factories raced against shortages and bombing raids to deliver units to frontline squadrons. But how long do you think the Hornisse actually lasted as an effective frontline weapon in World War II? 2 years, 3 years, or even longer? Drop your answer below and stay with us until the end of this video to discover the truth. The Messerschmitt Me-410's baptism of fire came in the spring of 1943, just as the United States Army Air Forces expanded their daylight bombing offensive against Germany. On May 13th, during a raid over Kiel, formations of B-17 flying fortresses were met not only by the familiar Bf-109s and FW-190s, but also by a new silhouette climbing rapidly to intercept. twin engines gleamed in the sunlight, and the long nose with protruding cannon barrels marked the arrival of the Hornisse. German crews of Zerstorer 26, the famed heavy fighter wing, had been among the first to receive the new aircraft. Their orders were direct: break open the tight American bomber boxes by sheer firepower. The Me-410's pilots formed up and dove in the bomber stream from above, unleashing salvos from their heavy armament. In one engagement, a Hornisse fitted with the BK-5 cannon fired at a fortress from over half a mile away. The shell tore through the bomber's wing root, and the massive four-engine aircraft spiraled downward in flames. From the American side, the impact was immediate. A gunner aboard the 381st Bomb Group later recalled, "We saw a flash, then the plane next to us just came apart. It was like someone had fired an artillery piece straight through the sky." For bomber crews accustomed to duels with nimble fighters, the Hornisse felt more like facing an airborne tank destroyer. Its attacks sowed confusion and fear, scattering tight formations that relied on mutual defense. Yet even in these early encounters, weaknesses were evident. In the same battle, several Me-410s pressed too close and were set upon by escorting Spitfires flying with the American formation. One Hornisse, trying to disengage, could not outturn its pursuers. The British fighters closed in and riddled it with .303 caliber fire until it exploded. Survivors among the German crews noted grimly that while the Me-410 could devastate bombers, it remained dangerously vulnerable once Allied fighters joined the fray. Despite these risks, for much of 1943, the Hornisse struck fear whenever it appeared. During raids on Bremen and Hamburg, bomber groups reported catastrophic losses whenever Me-410s mounted coordinated attacks. Pilots exploited their ability to strike from beyond defensive gun range, using the 30 million Malawian Quachas 103 cannons to pick off B-17s one by one. In some missions, American losses spiked so high that crews began to whisper that it was better to let the Hornisse exhaust its ammunition rather than confront it head-on. A Luftwaffe pilot of ZG-76 described the sensation of flying a new machine. You felt like you carried the hammer of Thor. But if a Mustang came into view, you knew that hammer could become an anvil in an instant. That duality, lethal against bombers, but fragile against fighters, would define the Me-410's brief frontline career. The first combat actions thus gave the Hornisse its reputation, a predator of bomber streams, capable of tearing holes in American formations, but also a reminder that firepower alone could not guarantee survival in skies now contested by ever stronger Allied escorts. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe deployed the Me-410 in significant numbers, assigning it to Zerstorer units tasked with breaking apart the relentless American bomber streams. The Hornisse quickly earned its reputation as a bomber destroyer. Equipped with heavy cannons, it could strike from outside the effective range of a fortress's .50 caliber machine guns, picking off individual aircraft with precision. In several raids over Bremen and Hamburg, Me-410s tore gaping holes in tight bomber formations, forcing squadrons to scatter and leaving stragglers to be finished off by Bf-109 and Fw-190 escorts. Tactically, the Me-410's introduction seemed to offer Germany a reprieve. Crews coordinated attacks in waves, diving from altitude and unleashing cannon fire into bomber boxes. Some Hornisses carried the massive 50mm BK-5 cannon, capable of firing a handful of devastating shells. American reports noted fortresses disintegrating after just one or two hits. A gunner from the 384th Bomb Group recalled, "We saw a flash from below, then one of our ships simply folded and went down. The others closed ranks tighter. We knew it had to be those new twin-engine fighters." Strategically, however, the Hornisse arrived too late. By the winter of 1943 to 44, the Allies had begun deploying long-range escort fighters. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. What had once been hunting grounds for the Me-410 became lethal traps. Bomber crews that once dreaded the Hornisse now watched as Mustangs pounced on the heavy fighters before they could line up their shots. Losses mounted, and entire Zerstory units were mauled in daylight battles over Germany. The contrast in production also told the story. While Germany built just over 1,000 Me-410s, the United States was producing hundreds of P-51s every month. The Hornisse could never match that scale. Its strength lay in its firepower, but in a war of numbers and endurance, agility and range proved decisive. Still, the Me-410 left an impact. Its presence forced the Allies to accelerate escort strategies, proving that unescorted bombers could not survive against determined defenders. In this way, the Hornisse shaped the doctrine of American daylight bombing, leading directly to the bomber escort, model that defined the final years of the air war. Compared to its rivals, the Hornisse was a paradox. The British Mosquito, often operating in the same skies, was faster, lighter, and multi-purpose, serving as a bomber, night fighter, and reconnaissance platform. The American P-38 Lightning, though vulnerable in European conditions, was more maneuverable and adaptable. The Me-410 was the most heavily armed of them all, but also the most specialized, and specialization often meant inflexibility. German pilots respected its strengths, but understood its weaknesses. One Luftwaffe officer later wrote, "Against the bombers, we were lions. Against the Mustangs, we were prey." That bitter recognition summed up the Hornisse legacy in combat. It was both feared and doomed, capable of inflicting painful blows on Allied bombers, yet unable to defend itself once the escorts arrived. In the end, the Hornisse influenced Allied and Axis thinking alike. It demonstrated the devastating effect of concentrated firepower, but also highlighted the fatal risk of relying on heavy fighters in skies, increasingly ruled by single-engine escorts and emerging jets. It was a weapon that forced a reaction, but one that could not dictate the outcome. The Hornisse entered combat in 1943 with great promise, hailed as the savior of Germany's heavy fighter program. Yet its career was short-lived. By mid-1944, Allied long-range escorts dominated the skies, and the Me-410's vulnerabilities became impossible to ignore. Entire Zerstory units were pulled from frontline duties, their remaining aircraft reassigned to reconnaissance or fast bomber roles. Production slowed, then ceased altogether as the Reich shifted its hopes toward jet aircraft like the Me-262. In operational terms, the Me-410 had served for little more than 2 years. This answers the question posed earlier. Despite its heavy firepower and terrifying early reputation, the Hornisse did not last 3 years as a frontline weapon. It was introduced in 1943 and effectively sidelined by late 1944. For the Luftwaffe, it was a stopgap measure, a machine that fought bravely but was swept aside by the pace of Allied innovation. After the war, only a handful of Me-410s remained intact. The Royal Air Force captured several examples and tested them to evaluate their firepower and speed. American crews also examined the Hornisse, intrigued by its remote control barbettes and massive nose-mounted cannon. None of these features carried over directly into Allied designs, but they serve as case studies of Germany's desperate attempts to engineer overwhelming weapons under pressure. Symbolically, the Hornisse became a cautionary tale. It showed that raw firepower alone could not secure air superiority. Flexibility, numbers, and endurance mattered more. Allied fighters outproduced, outlasted, and outmaneuvered it, leaving the Hornisse as a striking but fleeting chapter in the air war over Europe. Still, its legacy remains. Aviation historians often note that the Me-410 pushed the limits of conventional piston engine firepower. Its use of a 50mm cannon in the air was a bold, almost reckless experiment, one that highlighted both German ingenuity and desperation. The Hornisse also influenced post-war thinking. It reminded designers that multi-role adaptability was often more valuable than sheer specialization. Today, the Hornisse is remembered less as a success than as a symbol of Germany's late-war struggles. Where the Mustang represented endurance and the Mosquito represented versatility, the Me-410 embodied a different truth. that even the most powerful sting could not turn the tide once the skies were lost. The Messerschmitt Me 410 Hornisse occupies a peculiar place in the memory of World War II. Unlike the iconic Spitfire or Mustang, celebrated as symbols of victory, the Hornisse stands as a reminder of a nation grasping for solutions in the face of overwhelming odds. It was not just an aircraft. It was an emblem of desperation, of ingenuity pushed to extremes, and of the harsh limits imposed by strategic reality. For German airmen, the Hornisse symbolized both pride and frustration. Pilots respected its devastating firepower, recalling how its cannons could tear open a bomber with a single burst. Yet the same men also remembered the sinking feeling when enemy escorts appeared on the horizon. Diaries from Luftwaffe veterans often describe the duality: confidence when diving on bomber streams, dread when Mustangs closed in. In that sense, the Hornisse reflected the Luftwaffe's own trajectory in the war: initial strength, followed by relentless decline. In German society, the aircraft was less celebrated than other wartime machines. It lacked the romantic aura of the Bf 109 or the futuristic allure of the Me 262. Instead, the Hornisse became part of a narrative of what might have been. Aviation writers after the war treated it as an example of wasted potential, an aircraft that arrived too late, produced in too few numbers, and deployed in skies already slipping away. In museums, surviving fragments of the Me 410 now serve as artifacts of Germany's late war struggle, polished not as trophies, but as lessons. Culturally, the Hornisse never gained the mythic status of Allied aircraft. Few films or novels feature it prominently. When it does appear, it is often as a formidable shadow in the path of bomber crews, a fleeting menace rather than a protagonist. Yet even in this limited role, it endures as a symbol of fear. American veterans, interviewed decades later, still remember the moment when a Hornisse loomed ahead, its cannon barrels glinting like spears. In terms of military thought, the Me 410 provided important lessons. It reinforced the idea that heavy fighters armed to destroy bombers were inherently vulnerable in contested skies. The Luftwaffe's reliance on specialized bomber destroyers highlighted the dangers of putting too much faith in raw firepower without securing air superiority. Post-war air forces would move away from such designs, favoring adaptable, multi-role aircraft that could fight both bombers and fighters. In this sense, the Hornisse influenced the evolution of air doctrine, not by its success, but by its failure. Modern historians often pair the Hornisse with its Allied counterparts, noting the contrast. Where the Mosquito thrived through speed and versatility, and the Mustang dominated through range and balance, the Me 410 embodied a different philosophy: overwhelming firepower as a single solution. That philosophy, tested in the crucible of the air war, proved insufficient. Today, the Hornisse survives only in fragments, airframes preserved in museums, rusting wrecks uncovered from fields, and black and white photographs of its brief, violent career. Visitors who stand before these relics are not greeted by the triumph of an icon, but by the sobering weight of history. They see an aircraft that promised much, delivered in moments, but could not alter the outcome. In the end, the Hornisse sting was sharp but short. Its image lingers not as a banner of glory, but as a symbol of ingenuity under siege, of a war machine stretched past its limits. In the quiet halls of aviation museums, where a lone Me 410 rests with its glass canopy dulled by time, the Hornisse whispers a lesson that still resonates: that even the fiercest predator cannot survive when the skies themselves have already been lost.